Evaluating the performance of fisheries with respect to economic outcomes is crucial for effective fisheries governance. Each individual fisher makes their own unique choices about what inputs to use and what and how much fish to catch, and that will depend on the management regime in place and the prices of those inputs and outputs. One way we can assess differences in outcomes is to use economic productivity analysis. We study Spencer Gulf and West Coast prawns because, like many South Australian fisheries, a regular survey collects rich individual data on costs, revenues and quantities. This means that we can look at different measures of economic performance and see how they relate to each other, and identify potential scope for increasing economic productivity. Plus, the Spencer Gulf and West Coast prawn fisheries are interesting in their own right. Optimal utilisation is one of the explicit management goals, and they use a co-management approach with a committee at sea making real-time effort decisions. We start by calculating technical efficiency, which is a measure of how much more output could be produced using the same amount of inputs if every fisher was operating like the best fishers in the fishery. And it can be calculated just from quantities of inputs and outputs. We also calculate value-based measures of efficiency, whether the best mix of inputs and outputs are being used and produced given the prices. We find that technical efficiency is relatively high in the Spencer Gulf and West Coast prawn fisheries. That is, the top half of vessels could only increase their outputs over inputs by about 10% if they operated like the best fishers. We find similarly high measures of cost and profit efficiency, but the mean of those is falling a little over time, and the gap between the top and bottom quarters is growing. So while the quantities of inputs and outputs are quite similar, there seems to be an increasing variation in both revenues and costs, hence profits. This means that for these fisheries, quantity-based measures are unlikely to be appropriate indicators for economic outcomes. We also observe that while these fisheries have an economic component in their stated policy objectives, they're managed using input controls. Hence, the levers that fishers can use to improve their economic outcomes are only through seeking ways to raise output prices or lower input costs, rather than by changing quantities. This lower variation in quantities than in values has potential implications for longer-term management pressures, as diverging economic outcomes can make cooperation more difficult. The Spencer Gulf and West Coast prawn fisheries have some excellent fishers with a delicious product. We want to make the best of them.